I was exiled from my own daughter's wedding. There is no gentler phrasing. That truth struck the moment I slit open the envelope. Her familiar script greeted me first. Elegant, flowing lines, the same loop she once scribbled on notes left atop the refrigerator. Yet within the fold, the joy of her announcement soured. The words that should have honored me, father of the bride, had been scratched away, replaced with a stranger's name. If you've ever been pushed aside by those you once cradled in your arms, you'll understand the sting. Stay with me. And if this account stirs something in you, lend a hand, like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. The walls shifted around me. My coffee cooled untouched. At first, I clung to denial, perhaps a printing mishap, an oversight. But no. The strike across my name was too precise, too intentional. Not a smudge of error, but a blade of dismissal. It was the kind of mark that sought to erase not just ink, but identity. I inhaled deeply, but memory intruded. The parades where she perched on my shoulders, the dusty softball fields, the quiet triumphs over late-night algebra scribbles at this very table. Were those moments so fragile they could be obliterated by a single pen stroke? Was I so easily disposable? I drove by the church listed on the card. The building throbbed with life, floral deliveries spilling fragrance, musicians rehearsing jubilant notes, linen-draped tables waiting for laughter. I parked across the street, a shadow witnessing what should have been my rightful moment. My hand locked on the steering wheel, too weighted to move. My phone trembled in my grasp. I almost called her, almost demanded an answer. But what words could bridge that chasm? Why am I no longer your father? I wasn't prepared for the reply. That evening, I placed the invitation beside her graduation photograph on the mantel. In that snapshot, she had flung her arms around me, whispering, "We did it, Dad." That plural had once bound us. Now the syllable was cleaved in two. Sleep abandoned me. Past midnight, I found myself again at the table, staring at the black slash where my name once stood. The house held a hollowness that pressed against my ribs. Each chair, each frame on the wall, seemed to echo the same unanswerable question: how could she cast me aside? Then I noticed it. Beyond the curtain, a dark sedan idled, engine humming low, headlights extinguished. It lingered long enough to seed unease, then slipped away into the night's veins. By dawn, clarity arrived like frost, two revelations sharp as glass. First, this was deliberate. She had chosen another man to stand in my place. Second, silence was no longer an option. I didn't yet understand the gravity of his hold over her, nor why she had erased me. But I knew I had to uncover the truth. Because a name can be slashed on parchment, but the bond of a father, that is carved in marrow, and cannot be erased so easily. I stirred before dawn, though slumber had scarcely brushed me. The invitation still loitered on the mantelpiece, glaring at me through the gray twilight like an unhealed wound. My house was so hushed it felt thunderous, every tick of the clock a hammer strike. I brewed coffee, poured it into the same weathered mug I had clutched for years, yet the acrid taste on my tongue owed nothing to the beans. One question chewed at me. Why him? Richard Hayes, her supposed godfather. He had never warmed a chair at our dinners, never clapped from the bleachers at her games, never steered the car through rain-slick streets to carry her safely to class. That was me. I was the one who steadied her handlebars when she first wobbled on a bike, the one who knelt to pick her up when she scraped her knees, the one who lifted her gently to bed after she fell asleep mid-chapter, books slipping from her fingers. Yet somehow my name had been slashed away, and his scrawled in its place. By late morning I could no longer suffocate in silence. I dialed her number, 3 rings, then her voice, buoyant, hurried, a melody half drowned by chaos. "Dad, sorry, can't talk much, the florist's here and you know how wedding storms are." I forced calm into my tone. I received the invitation. A pause, too stretched to be comfortable. "Oh, good, glad it reached you." "Emily," I murmured, "there's something I need to ask." But a voice in the background called her name, laughter echoed, glass clinked. She cut me short. "I'll call you later, okay? Love you." The line snapped dead. The silence afterward weighed like lead. I stared at the phone, dissecting every syllable of her tone. It was cheerful, polished, rehearsed almost. and it left me with nothing but shadows. That afternoon I drifted into town. At the diner where we'd shared 100 breakfasts, I ordered pie, though it sat untouched. My eyes kept straying to the corner booth where she once slid in beside me, legs dangling, peppering me with questions about math problems and the nature of kindness. Now, another man's name had replaced mine in the sacred ledger of family. I abandoned the plate, steam still rising. That evening I opened old albums. Each photograph screamed of the role I once held, central, irreplaceable. Her in a prom gown, me fumbling behind the camera. Her shaking hands with her dean, me blurred at the edge, tears unspilled. It wasn't nostalgia that stabbed. It was the thought that perhaps she wanted to bury these memories beneath another man's shadow. Days limped forward. Then arrived the rehearsal dinner. My name absent from the guest list, yet I went. From beyond the banquet hall windows I watched. The glow of candlelight, the music of laughter. At the head table Emily gleamed, her fiancé beside her, and on her other side, where I should have been, sat Richard Hayes. He raised a glass, words smooth as honey, and applause rippled through the room. He clasped her hand. She smiled, though to my eyes there was a tightness beneath the curve, a shadow within her brightness. A father notices. I pressed closer to the glass, my breath fogging the pain. My reflection stared back, a ghost barred from his own blood celebration. I nearly stormed and demanded truth, but fear whispered, what if she renounced me before them all? Pride quarreled with dread, and dread triumphed. I staggered back to the car, fists clamped on the wheel till my knuckles blanched. Their muffled joy drifted into the night, a cruel hymn. Sleep abandoned me. I heard their voices in my skull hymn, spinning tales as if entitled to them, her laughing gently, desperate for peace, me erased, invisible. At dawn I found a letter slipped under my door. No envelope, just folded paper. Marjorie, an old friend from church, had written. She'd glimpsed the seating chart. "William," she wrote, "your chair is missing. The program names Hayes as the one to walk Emily down the aisle. I don't know why, but you should be braced." My throat locked. Not only was I struck from the invitation, but erased from the day itself. I set the letter beside the invitation, 2 slips of paper, 2 betrayals etched in ink. Yet in the ashes of grief a new fire stirred, resolve. If Emily had truly chosen Hayes, I needed to see it face to face. But if she was being steered, coerced, bent to another's will, then I had to uncover it with my own eyes. Because fathers do not vanish. Not willingly. The dawn following Marjorie's missive pressed upon the house with a suffocating closeness, as though the walls had shrunk, boxing me into a space too small for air. At the table, 2 objects bore down on me with equal weight, the gilded invitation and her sharp-edged note, 1 erased name, 1 stolen seat, 1 father silently dethroned. I realized staring at ink and paper would yield nothing but torment. If I longed for truth, I had to confront the man himself, Richard Hayes. His name had drifted around my life the way forecasts drift on the radio, present, inevitable, but never tethered to my own existence. A financier who ran his empire of investment houses, a benefactor whose checks reshaped civic skylines, a man whose toothy grin occupied newspapers beside mayors and judges. I had clasped his hand once or twice at fundraisers, fleeting, perfunctory, nothing more. And yet there it was now, etched into the very place where my own had belonged for decades. So I steered into town that night, my chest tight with unrest after the rehearsal dinner. His figure beside Emily haunted me. I promised myself I would remain an observer, quiet, invisible. But fathers, when it comes to daughters, cannot remain statues for long. The downtown hotel rose like a citadel of brass and marble, polished to a gleam. I hadn't set foot inside in years. Its luxury seemed built for others, men in suits, not a carpenter whose hammer bore 40 years of calluses. I lingered by the lounge archway. There he sat, Hayes, anchored at a round table, encircled by men whose suits whispered affluence. His arm lounged over the chair, laughter ringing out like a trumpet, commanding eyes. Then Emily appeared, my daughter, clipboard in hand, murmuring to the event planner, hair falling loose, her movements taut with the kind of exhaustion only brides endure. She was radiant, yes, but the shine dimmed by strain. I expected Hayes to nod politely, the gesture of a distant acquaintance. Instead, he rose, draped a hand upon her shoulder, and paraded her forward as though she were a trophy displayed under his ownership. Applause, a forced smile, a fire kindled in my gut. I did not erupt, not yet, but I edged closer, ear-catching fragments. "Everything under control," Hayes purred, smooth as oil. "Sweetheart, I'll handle the donors. Sweetheart." The word was a stone hurled at my chest. Emily's smile faltered, eyes darting away, embarrassed, caged. He squeezed her shoulder, reclaimed his chair, basked again in his audience. I departed unseen, but his hand on her, his voice filling the void, those images clung like burrs. That night I lay awake. Why would she permit it? Gratitude for his wealth, some unspoken debt, or had he pressed her into compliance, subtle and relentless, until acquiescence felt easier than defiance? By afternoon, fate crossed my path with Marjorie outside the church. Hymnals balanced in her frail arms, glasses slipping down her nose. She caught my sleeve. "William," she whispered, urgency trembling, "be cautious. Hayes has been with the pastor dictating music, the processional, even who stands where. He said it would reflect family priorities." Family, the syllables soured my tongue. Marjorie lowered her gaze. "It's as though he's rewriting the ceremony itself." As though, she stopped, words too heavy to finish. I thanked her, though thanks felt brittle. Enough had been revealed. Hayes was not merely filling my shadow. He was rearranging the very stage, replacing brick by brick what once was mine. That evening I drifted past the banquet hall. Through broad windows, Hayes stood at the podium, voice booming, glass raised, crowd roaring. Emily sat beside him, smile sculpted, hands knotted in her lap like prisoners. And once more I stood outside, reflection blurred against glass, a father watching his role enacted by another man. I willed myself to leave, but then a glimpse froze me, a folder on the table before Hayes, half hidden. Even with age-dimmed sight I discerned the bold letters, financial agreement, not flowers, not vows, not hymns, finances. A vise clamped my chest. Why would a man not bound by blood be entrusted with contracts of that weight? I retreated before rage carried me inside, but the folder's image lingered like a brand. All night I replayed it, pairing it with the way Emily avoided his gaze, the way his voice claimed ownership. This was no longer about a stolen walk down the aisle, no longer about ink blotting out my name. It was about dominion, money, control, influence. If Hayes could revise the script of a wedding, what chapters of her life had he already redrafted? At dawn, I returned to the kitchen table. Invitation on the mantel, letter beside it, and now the seared memory of that folder. For the first time my question shifted. No longer why did she replace me, but what is he taking from her? And that alteration, subtle as a hinge turning, changed everything. I could no longer suppress the unease. That folder, gripped in his hand like a trophy already won, gnawed at my thoughts until silence itself became unbearable. So I resolved I would confront Emily. Not through the cold static of a call, not filtered through the blur of wedding rehearsals, but face to face. A father deserves at least that much. The hotel pulsed with the rhythm of anticipation. The clatter of luggage carts, the murmur of hurried voices, the crystalline chime of champagne flutes. Guests swirled about, arms laden with gowns and blossoms, moving like bees circling their hive. I threaded through this tide unseen, a ghost drifting toward the elevators. My fingers trembled as I pressed the button. Not rage, but something softer, fear. Fear that the girl who once clutched my hand in fireworks-lit skies would now open the door as a stranger. Her suite waited at the corridor's end, its entrance adorned with a wreath of pale roses. I lingered, rehearsing futile phrases. "Emily, give me a moment. Emily, it's your father. Emily, please." I knocked. The door cracked. She stood there, silk robe, hair half-tamed, eyes widened as though she had seen an apparition. "Dad," her tone held both warmth and remorse, the same timbre I'd heard when she was caught pilfering cookies as a child. "Yes, sweetheart," I whispered. "Just a few minutes, nothing more." She faltered, glanced down the hallway, then yielded. The door opened wider and I stepped inside. Chaos painted the room, dresses strewn across chairs, makeup cases yawning open, ribbons dangling from boxes. By the window, a table buried beneath lists and envelopes bore the weight of unchecked tasks. Emily shut the door swiftly, fingers still clinging to the knob. "What are you doing here?" she asked, uneasy, not angry. "I had to see you to understand why." Her gaze skittered away. "Dad, not now." Everything spinning out of control. I leaned closer, lowering my voice. "Emily, I saw him. Hayes, the way he commands the room, that folder he brandishes. Tell me he's not binding you to something you don't desire." Her lips parted, but before sound could form, the door flung wide. He entered as though the room bore his name. Richard Hayes, polished suit, silver tie, a smile sharpened into artifice. "Well," he said silkily, "I wondered when you'd arrive." Emily recoiled, caught in the crossfire. Hayes shut the door with unhurried certainty, his hand settling on her shoulder like a seal of ownership. "This is private," I said, my voice taut. "This is family business," he replied, wearing confidence like armor. "Family." The word curdled on his tongue. Emily began to speak, but Hayes silenced her with a patron's gesture, as though correcting a pupil. "Darling, you've enough to worry about. Let me manage this." "Don't call her that," I snapped. He turned, smile edged with menace. "While you vanished, I remained, planning, arranging, ensuring perfection. This wedding needs steadiness, not sentiment." "Steadiness," I countered, "by erasing her father, by striking my name as if it never existed." Emily winced, her hands twisting at her robe's ribbon. Hayes ignored her, drilling me with his gaze. "You've had your years, William. You raised her, yes. But she steps into a world requiring more than sawdust memories and rustic wisdom. She needs guidance you cannot provide." Each syllable landed like a gavel strike. I turned to Emily. "Sweetheart, look at me. Is this what you want? Say it yourself." Her lips trembled. For a heartbeat, the child I remembered flickered in her eyes, but Hayes slid between us, blocking the view. "She doesn't need to answer," he said, finality lacing his tone. "We both know this conversation ends here." He steered her gently toward the vanity, dismissing me as though I were already exiled from her life. I stood still, fury boiling but tempered by a greater terror that pressing harder might shatter her beyond repair. I walked to the door, each step heavy. Before leaving, I looked back. Emily sat stiff at the mirror, eyes lowered, while Hayes adjusted her hairpin with the care of possession. The latch clicked behind me. In the hallway, I sagged against the wall, breath ragged. Distant laughter and music spilled from other rooms, a celebration swelling without me. I drifted toward the elevator, hollowed. A stack of ceremony programs sat abandoned on a side table. Without thought, I lifted one. Black ink sealed the truth, escorted by Mr. Richard Hayes. No strikeouts, no corrections, just absence where my name belonged. I folded the paper, tucked it into my pocket, and stepped into the heavy dusk air. Something within me snapped into clarity. This was no longer about a walk down an aisle. It was about the truth, the shadowed power Hayes wielded, written not in vows but in contracts whispered behind closed doors. And I knew this much. Before the bells tolled, I would uncover precisely what Richard Hayes sought, because it was never simply my daughter's devotion. It was something far larger, something laced with calculation. And my time to act was vanishing. When I crossed the threshold of my home, the stillness reverberated like a struck gong. I had long equated silence with serenity, yet that night it draped itself like a shroud of abandonment, as though my erasure from the wedding program had already seeped into the timber of these walls. The folded sheet inside my pocket bore an unexpected weight. Escorted by Mr. Richard Hayes. Not a mere slight, it was a distortion of lineage, a brazen rewrite of my place in the story. And the memory of that folder on his table haunted me still. Financial agreement. I lowered myself into the chair at my old desk, where the resinous scent of cedar lingered in the joints of its drawers. For years, I had scribbled ledgers there, sturdy pencil strokes chronicling every contract, every board, every nail. Hayes, a man whose palms had never known callous, now held sway over agreements tethered to my daughter's name. Driven by instinct, the same instinct that once foretold where beams might sag or roofs might seep, I opened my records. Hayes's certainty felt too secure, anchored in something deeper than mere charisma. At dawn, I wandered into the hardware store. I didn't truly need supplies. I needed Frank, the proprietor who had clasped my hand for 3 decades. His handshake was unwavering, though his eyes probed me with concern. "You look worn, Will. Didn't sleep." "Not much," I murmured. "Tell me, Frank, has Hayes crossed paths with any contractors lately?" His brow creased. "Hayes, odd you mention him. Just weeks ago, someone came asking about estimates for refurbishing the parish hall. Dropped Hayes's name, claimed the funding was secured. Big sums out of thin air. The parish hall, the very church where Emily's vows would soon be spoken." I drove straight there. The secretary, her silver hair coiled neatly, welcomed me with gentle courtesy. I asked, careful not to stir alarm. "Yes," she confirmed, shuffling through papers. "Mr. Hayes pledged a generous donation on condition of certain accommodations." "Accommodations," she lowered her voice. "Priority reservations, preferred dates, even a commemorative plaque." The pastor agreed it was hard to decline such largesse. Money, always money. I returned to my truck, the spring sun piercing like glass. The pattern was coalescing. Hayes wasn't only embedding himself into Emily's wedding, he was chiseling himself into the fabric of the parish, the very community that once belonged to us. That evening my old habits returned. Hours hunched over receipts and contracts, the same stubborn diligence I had once given to sanding wood until its veins revealed themselves. I called Tom Bradley, an accountant who had once steered me through tax seasons. "Tom," I began with care, "have you ever encountered Hayes's companies?" A pause heavy as stone. "William, you know I can't disclose client affairs." "I'm not asking for details. Just should I be uneasy if his name circles my family?" Tom sighed. "Then I'll say this, tread warily. His firms shuffle money swiftly. On paper it gleams with generosity, but most roads lead back to Hayes himself. He's trusted because he looks the part, but his books, they rarely reconcile clean." The word ledgers clung to me as stubborn as sawdust on sweat. 2 evenings before the wedding, I slipped into the church at dusk, not for prayer but for watchfulness. I lingered in the shadows while volunteers arranged chairs. On the altar, Hayes conferred with the pastor, folder in hand, gesturing with the fluency of command. From the pews, my jaw hardened. He wasn't just guiding the ceremony, he was crafting a stage, a drama where my role had been erased. Emily arrived, hesitant, her hands restless. She whispered to him. He smiled, placated her with a gentle pat, then passed her a paper. She sighed, folded it into her purse. No bride ever sighed over vows. That night my table was buried beneath ledgers, contracts, and receipts, a lifetime of proof that what I built was honest, solid, enduring. Hayes might gild his empire with donations and plaques, but timber and stone cannot lie. Yet the question gnawed. If he could slip his name into programs and church deals, where else had his pen already intruded? Was my daughter's future being inked away, document by quiet document? Close to midnight, headlights swept across my wall. A car idled outside. My pulse quickened. At the window I saw him, Hayes, silhouetted by the dashboard glow. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He simply studied me, his stare long, deliberate, as though gauging dimensions on blueprints. Then, without a gesture, he rolled off, taillights dissolving into black. I remained at the glass long after, chest hammering. This was no longer about omission from a wedding. It had become a contest of shadows. Hayes had drawn me into a game, one I had never consented to play. And if he could sit outside my home in the still of night, silent and brazen, then his designs for Emily, and for me, were not only larger but far darker than I had ever fathomed. When I crossed the threshold of my home, the stillness reverberated like a struck gong. I had long equated silence with serenity, yet that night it draped itself like a shroud of abandonment, as though my erasure from the wedding program had already seeped into the timber of these walls. The folded sheet inside my pocket bore an unexpected weight. escorted by Mr. Richard Hayes. Not a mere slight, it was a distortion of lineage, a brazen rewrite of my place in the story, and the memory of that folder on his table haunted me still. Financial agreement. I lowered myself into the chair at my old desk, where the resinous scent of cedar lingered in the joints of its drawers. For years, I had scribbled ledgers there, sturdy pencil strokes chronicling every contract, every board, every nail. Hayes, a man whose palms had never known callous, now held sway over agreements tethered to my daughter's name, driven by instinct, the same instinct that once foretold where beams might sag or roofs might seep. I opened my records. Hayes's certainty felt too secure, anchored in something deeper than mere charisma. At dawn, I wandered into the hardware store. I didn't truly need supplies. I needed Frank, the proprietor who had clasped my hand for 3 decades. His handshake was unwavering, though his eyes probed me with concern. "You look worn, Will. Didn't sleep?" "Not much," I murmured. "Tell me, Frank, has Hayes crossed paths with any contractors lately?" His brow creased. "Hayes, odd you mention him. Just weeks ago, someone came asking about estimates for refurbishing the parish hall. Dropped Hayes's name, claimed the funding was secured. Big sums out of thin air. The parish hall, the very church where Emily's vows would soon be spoken. I drove straight there. The secretary, her silver hair coiled neatly, welcomed me with gentle courtesy. I asked, careful not to stir alarm. "Yes," she confirmed, shuffling through papers. "Mr. Hayes pledged a generous donation on condition of certain accommodations." Accommodations, she lowered her voice. Priority reservations, preferred dates, even a commemorative plaque. The pastor agreed it was hard to decline such largesse. Money, always money. I returned to my truck, the spring sun piercing like glass. The pattern was coalescing. Hayes wasn't only embedding himself into Emily's wedding, he was chiseling himself into the fabric of the parish, the very community that once belonged to us. That evening my old habits returned. Hours hunched over receipts and contracts, the same stubborn diligence I had once given to sanding wood until its veins revealed themselves. I called Tom Bradley, an accountant who had once steered me through tax seasons. "Tom," I began with care, "have you ever encountered Hayes's companies?" A pause heavy as stone. "William, you know I can't disclose client affairs." "I'm not asking for details. Just should I be uneasy if his name circles my family?" Tom sighed. "Then I'll say this, tread warily. His firms shuffle money swiftly. On paper it gleams with generosity, but most roads lead back to Hayes himself. He's trusted because he looks the part, but his books, they rarely reconcile clean." The word ledgers clung to me, as stubborn as sawdust on sweat. 2 evenings before the wedding, I slipped into the church at dusk, not for prayer but for watchfulness. I lingered in the shadows while volunteers arranged chairs. On the altar, Hayes conferred with the pastor, folder in hand, gesturing with the fluency of command. From the pews my jaw hardened. He wasn't just guiding the ceremony, he was crafting a stage, a drama where my role had been erased. Emily arrived, hesitant, her hands restless. She whispered to him. He smiled, placated her with a gentle pat, then passed her a paper. She sighed, folded it into her purse. No bride ever sighed over vows. That night my table was buried beneath ledgers, contracts, and receipts, a lifetime of proof that what I built was honest, solid, enduring. Hayes might gild his empire with donations and plaques, but timber and stone cannot lie. Yet the question gnawed. If he could slip his name into programs and church deals, where else had his pen already intruded? Was my daughter's future being inked away, document by quiet document? Close to midnight, headlights swept across my wall. A car idled outside. My pulse quickened. At the window I saw him, Hayes, silhouetted by the dashboard glow. He didn't wave, didn't smile. He simply studied me, his stare long, deliberate, as though gauging dimensions on blueprints. Then, without a gesture, he rolled off, taillights dissolving into black. I remained at the glass long after, chest hammering. This was no longer about omission from a wedding. It had become a contest of shadows. Hayes had drawn me into a game, one I had never consented to play. And if he could sit outside my home in the still of night, silent and brazen, then his designs for Emily, and for me, were not only larger but far darker than I had ever fathomed. That night when Hayes loitered outside my dwelling, sleep abandoned me. I lingered in the parlor until dawn's first pale blade sliced through the blinds, my eyes anchored on the strip of pavement where his car had prowled. The hush was not the kind born of chance, it was deliberate, a muted declaration that I was an intruder in my own orbit. This was not a lover's quarrel, it was a man staking dominion. By sunrise, resolve calcified, I would confront Emily, and this time, not Hayes nor any other shadow would obstruct me. I waited until the late hours when the hotel lobby had thinned, suitcases rolled away, murmurs dissipated, staff gliding like phantoms between shifts. I entered with a gait that did not falter, burdened with nothing save the gravity of a father's insistence. She was there, bent over a lattice of seating cards, her hair tethered back, shoulders heavy with fatigue. I advanced carefully, wary that suddenness might scatter her into retreat. "Emily," I murmured. She lifted her gaze. The exhaustion swimming in her eyes struck like a blow. Silence pooled between us. Then a subtle nod, a fragile summons. "5 minutes," she whispered. "Not here, upstairs." Her chamber was cloaked, curtains sealed, remnants of preparation strewn like wreckage across the bed. She perched on the mattress's edge, ribbon twisting endlessly in her fingers. I remained near the window, a sentinel giving her air. "Dad," she said, voice splintering, "I never wanted you to stumble on it this way." I offered her silence, the kind that invited truth. "It isn't the ceremony, not entirely, it's money debts." The floor shifted beneath me. "Whose?" I asked. Her eyes shimmered, damp with restraint. "Mine." The tale emerged jagged, fractured. After college, she had poured hope into a wellness clinic with companions. Within a year it crumbled. Loans multiplied, creditors, leases, gnawing bills. She had hidden it, shackled by shame, unwilling to tarnish the man who built with sweat and stone. "I thought I could mend it," she whispered. "I thought I could climb out, but the interest bred like weeds. I was drowning." Then Hayes entered, serpent-cloaked as savior. He swept away the creditors, bundled the debts, dangled a clean ledger. But salvation came bound in chains. He said the only path forward was to let him direct the wedding. The church, the deals, everything. He told me it would secure my future. My fingers crushed the back of a chair until the wood cried beneath my palm. My Emily, radiant Emily, ensnared in a bargain, Hayes clutching the key. "Why not me?" I asked. Her shoulders shook. "Because I was ashamed. You forged everything with honesty, caution, and I gambled and failed. I couldn't bear your eyes." I crossed to her, knelt, gathered her trembling hands. "Emily, nothing, no misstep, no ruin could unmake you mine. Nothing." Her tears broke like a storm at last, her brow resting on my shoulder. When calm finally settled, she pulled away, though her gaze remained clouded. "Dad, he has contracts, agreements I signed. If I defy him, he'll unleash the debt again. He swore he can destroy me legally, drag you with me. That's why I let him strike your name. I thought it was the ransom to keep the rest intact." The truth cleaved sharper than betrayal. She hadn't turned against me. She had been bound, her voice gagged by ink and clauses. I stood, pacing, mind snapping back to the folder Hayes caressed at his table. Financial agreement scrawled like a crown jewel. Not mere paper, it was the chain shackling her life. "Do you have copies?" I asked. She gestured to the nightstand. A thin envelope, heavy with menace. I slid it open, contracts meticulous, strangling, repayment webs, collateral traps, clauses vague enough to grant Hayes dominion over every coin. Her signature lay there, clean, trusting, betrayed. My stomach heaved. Her voice was small. "Dad, don't inflame it, let the wedding pass. Hayes said he'll loosen once it's sealed, that's his promise." I turned sharply. "And you believe him?" Her silence was answer enough. I tucked the documents into my jacket, her eyes widened in alarm. "Dad, I won't leave them here," I said. "If Hayes wields these as chains, then the only path forward is to sever his weapon." Terror flared in her face. "He'll know." "Let him," I replied, my tone steadier than my pulse. "A father does not yield his daughter's fate to another man's pen." As I departed, Hayes's shadow seemed stitched into every corridor, every groan of the elevator. He would discover soon enough. He would hunt. But for the first time since that cursed invitation, I did not feel erased. I felt necessary, ignited, because truth had surfaced. Emily's silence was not betrayal, it was captivity. And with that envelope in my grasp, the balance of the game had turned. The packet pressed against my chest inside the jacket as I steered home, every mile resounding like a war drum beneath my ribs. For decades, I had hoisted timbers, hammered nails, and raised walls beam by beam. Yet never had I borne a burden as suffocating as those folded contracts. I slid the envelope into the desk's hidden cavity, tucking it beneath brittle tax ledgers and sepia-stained photographs. A key turned in the lock with the same caution I once used securing my toolboxes at job sites. Still, I could not silence the phantom glow seeping through the drawer's wood, pulsing with peril. Sleep was no refuge. That night, Emily appeared in my dream, small fingers clutching my sleeve at the fairground. "Don't let go, Dad," she pleaded, her child's voice piercing with urgency. I swore I wouldn't. Yet dawn's pale shaft across the floor mocked the promise, trembling in its fragility. By mid-morning, the inevitable shadow of Hayes had lengthened. My phone jolted with an unknown number. Silence stretched across the line, then a gravel-low murmur. "That envelope is not yours." A click. I set the phone down like unexploded ordnance. My house shrank inward, every corner barbed with suspicion. I sought the pulse of town to steady myself, but at the diner the hum of chatter faltered. Eyes lifted, then fell to coffee cups. Plates clinked indifferent. I lowered into a booth, the pie untouched, appetite gone brittle. Frank, broad-shouldered from the hardware shop, slid across from me without welcome, his brow carved deep. "Will," he said carefully, "word is Hayes claims you're unraveling, that you're sabotaging Emily's wedding out of envy." The syllable cracked like a hammer on brittle stone. "Envy?" He spread his palms. "People talk. Hayes carries weight. Ears bend." By afternoon, suffocation drove me to the church. The air there promised sanctuary, yet the secretary's voice was clipped. "Mr. Hayes asked that we avoid disturbances for the sanctity of the ceremony." Disturbance, that was me now. And then Hayes appeared, emerging with polished calm from the pastor's office, silver tie catching light like a blade. His smile was cordial, honed sharp. "William," he greeted, mock warmth in the syllables. "I hear you've kept yourself occupied." I ground my jaw. "You've stripped enough." He leaned close, voice edged with iron. "Those documents tether your daughter's fate to me. Return them and perhaps you'll still watch from the back pew." It wasn't fury that chilled me, it was his audacity, tossing scraps as if I were a beggar clawing for relevance. I walked away, but his smoke-tainted words coiled after me. That evening, Emily's call trembled through the line. "Dad, Hayes knows, he's livid, he says you stole from him." "Stole?" I breathed. "Those papers are chains, Emily. I took them because you couldn't." Her whisper frayed. "I know, but he's turning everyone. Even Mom thinks you're losing your grip." Her words cracked something marrow deep. My ex-wife's distrust of my stubbornness, weaponized by Hayes, cut like rusted steel. I sat in darkness, envelope before me on the desk. One part of me longed to shred it, burn it, scatter ash into oblivion. Yet another part knew it was my single bulwark, my frail proof. Outside, headlights crawled slow. Not the same car, but the same lingering prowl. Hayes no longer concealed his hounds. He wanted me to feel the snare tightening. The next morning, the bank's call came. Tom Bradley's voice was strained, almost apologetic. "Will, inquiries surfaced about your account's collateral liens. I blocked it, but Hayes is prying." My chest cinched. His reach extended beyond Emily now, into my life's marrow, into the house I'd raised nail by nail. Hayes had coffers, lawyers, influence. I had a locked drawer and a crumbling reputation. For the first time, the question pierced me, could he actually triumph? Nightfall pressed heavy. My phone lay mute, neighbors' windows flickering with suspicion. I was a carpenter in a town built of whispers, and Hayes conducted the chorus. A glass of bourbon steadied no nerves. My reflection in the window pane was a stranger, lined, weary, dim-eyed, and doubt hissed, maybe Emily would be safer if I vanished. Maybe surrender would be gentler than war. But then, the mantle. A photograph of Emily in her cap and gown, her arms slung tight around me, laughter spilling from both our faces. "We did it, Dad," she'd said. "Not I, not him, we." Resolve cracked through the doubt like daylight through a storm cloud. Near midnight I unlocked the drawer. The envelope lay waiting, contracts unfurled beneath the lamp's glow. Hayes believed these papers rendered him unassailable, but carpentry had taught me, even the gnarliest knot yields if worked with patience. Somewhere inside the labyrinth of clauses lay the flaw. The weak seemed to splinter his frame, and I would uncover it, for if this was my midnight, then dawn was the only horizon left. The lamp smoldered weakly on my desk, its glow spilling over the contracts like moonlight fractured across ink-black waters. I lingered over the same passage again and again, each sentence a snarled rope resisting my hands. The jargon of law had always been a foreign tongue to me, phrases piled like barricades meant to keep simple men on the outside. Yet carpentry had taught me a quiet truth. No knot is eternal. Somewhere, within every twist, lies a frail strand waiting to be undone. At first glance the pages thundered permanence, binding obligation, irrevocable terms, exclusive claim. Hayes had forged his trap with meticulous care, but carpenters endure on patience, and I carried patience like a second heartbeat. My gaze finally arrested upon a buried line midway through the fourth page. Collateral arrangement to be secured by mutual consent, subject to annual review. Annual review. The words shone like raw sawdust catching dawn's light. Renewal each year meant Hayes's hold was not steel but seasonal, like a fence post resting in shallow earth. I circled the phrase, pulse hammering. Emily's signature had dried in spring. Renewal would not arrive until the week following the wedding. Hayes had cloaked silence around that detail because illusion was his strongest timber. Still, I would not wager my daughter's future on my solitary reading. At daybreak, I roused Tom Bradley. His voice rasped with fatigue, but when I read the clause, a low whistle broke through. "Will, that's not trivial. Hayes's grip isn't perpetual. If Emily declines renewal, the deal collapses. He might drag it through the courts, but judges despise murky collateral wording. You've got leverage." Leverage. The word fit awkwardly in my mouth, but it tasted right. "Tom," I said, "can you set that in writing?" A silence stretched. "You know that pins me to your side." "Yes," I whispered. "And I'd never ask if it weren't for Emily." A weary sigh. "I'll draft it." Relief washed through me, sharp as a blade. Weeks of drowning gave way to the faint feel of earth beneath my boots, but earth shifts quick. That afternoon, stepping from Tom's office, I spotted Hayes's car stationed half a block away. He sat behind the wheel, sunglasses masking his eyes beneath a slate sky, jaw locked. He didn't lower the glass, didn't nod, only followed me with that predatory stillness as I walked past. If he sensed I had found a fracture, he would strike before I could swing the hammer. Back home, I slid Tom's draft into an old toolbox beneath the workshop floorboards. The same box that once carried my first hammer, dented and scarred but unyielding. If Hayes hungered to steal, he'd need to pry apart the very planks I had laid. That night, Emily's voice cracked over the line. "He's furious, Dad, more than ever before. He says you're sabotaging him, that you're ruining everything. He threatened to pull his money from the church renovations." "Emily," I said gently, "hear me. You do not owe him your existence. His contract isn't the fortress he claims." Her silence stretched long, then fragile as glass. "If you're wrong, he'll destroy me. If I'm wrong," I admitted, "we both fall, but if I'm right, we rise together." The next day murmurs spread through town. At the diner, I caught two men whispering at the counter. "Hayes says the old carpenter's bitter, couldn't stomach letting go." I stirred my coffee slowly, bitter perhaps, but never broken. That evening I drifted into the church beneath the guise of prayer. Hayes stood near the altar, pacing with the pastor, his voice slithered, slick with authority. "We cannot let William disrupt. He's unstable. If he shows at the ceremony, remove him." Ice coursed through my veins. Hayes wasn't just twisting my place. He was erasing my right to breathe within those walls. I stepped deeper into shadow, fists clenched. But in my pocket, Tom's draft lay folded tight, a nail already loosened, awaiting one true strike. Sleep abandoned me that night. I paced beneath the gaze of Emily's photograph in cap and gown, her smile a reminder of the vow I'd once whispered in a dream. "Don't let go, Dad." Hayes believed ink and whispers could erase me, but a father's grasp is not loosened by parchment. I spread Tom's draft upon the desk, traced the lines as though carving wood. Tomorrow I would set this weakness before Hayes where he least expected, not to desecrate Emily's wedding but to free it from his false claim of ownership. But as I doused the lamp, headlights slid across my window. This time, the car did not idle. A note slipped beneath my door, stark against the floorboards. I unfolded it with cold fingers. "Return what is mine, or your daughter loses more than a father." No name signed, none required. The battlefield was drawn, and the wedding loomed but 2 days away. The morning before the wedding, I woke with the kind of heaviness that doesn't belong to the body but to the soul. The note Hayes had slid under my door lay on the kitchen table, its words still sharp enough to cut. "Return what's mine, or your daughter loses more than a father." I kept reading that line as the coffee cooled in my mug. I wasn't sure if he meant reputation or livelihood or something darker. What I knew was this: he was done hiding. And so was I. By midday, the town hummed with talk. At the hardware store, 2 clerks lowered their voices when I walked past. At the diner, the waitress avoided my eyes. It was clear Hayes's campaign had spread. William Harlan, the unstable father, jealous of a man who'd rescued his daughter. I drove past the church and saw workers hanging flowers, musicians unloading cases, chairs lined in neat rows across the lawn. A wedding is supposed to be a celebration of union. To me, it looked like a stage built for erasure. Still, deep inside, I carried the envelope's weight, not as a burden anymore, but as a weapon. The clause Tom had confirmed, the statement he'd written, it was all there, folded tight, waiting. That afternoon, I went to see Emily. She was in the church hall with her bridesmaids, folding napkins, checking ribbons. When she saw me, her face lit with worry. "Dad, you shouldn't be here," she whispered, pulling me aside. "Hayes sees you." "I'm not hiding anymore," I said. "Emily, listen, I found a way out. The contract isn't binding the way he claims. You can refuse renewal." Her breath caught. "Are you sure?" "Yes, Tom confirmed it in writing. He can't touch you if you walk away." Tears welled in her eyes, but she shook her head. "He'll find another way. He always does." Before I could answer, footsteps echoed. Hayes entered the hall, his suit immaculate, his smile stretched thin. "Well," he said, "a family reunion." The bridesmaids went quiet, folding napkins with forced attention. Hayes approached, his gaze fixed on me. "I warned you, William, you don't belong here." I held his stare. "This is my daughter's wedding. I belong more than you ever will." He chuckled, but his eyes were steel. "Is that what you tell yourself, that you're still relevant? Look around. The town believes me. The church listens to me, even your daughter." "Stop," Emily said sharply, surprising us both. Her voice shook, but her back was straight. "Don't speak for me." For a heartbeat, silence filled the hall. Hayes recovered quickly, smiling at her as though indulging a child. "Stress talking, nothing more. You'll thank me tomorrow, darling." That word again, darling, it lodged in my chest like a splinter. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "I know about the clause, Hayes. Annual renewal. Your empire rests on a single line of text, and tomorrow it ends." His smile faltered just for a moment before returning sharper than ever. "Be careful, William. Threats don't suit you." "It's not a threat," I said. "It's a father's promise." Hayes straightened, adjusting his cufflinks with practiced calm. "Enjoy your fantasy while it lasts. Tomorrow, when the bells ring, you'll be standing outside with your papers, and I'll be walking her down the aisle. That's the only reality that matters." Then he turned to Emily, brushed her arm lightly, and left the hall with the slow confidence of a man certain of victory. Emily sagged against the wall once he was gone. "Dad, what if he's right? What if no one listens?" I touched her shoulder gently. Then we show them, not with whispers, not with anger, but with proof. I built houses with nails and wood, Emily. I know what it means to stand firm when storms come. Tomorrow, you stand with me or without me, but know this, he doesn't own you. She nodded, lips pressed tight, eyes full of fear and hope tangled together. That night I couldn't sleep. The house groaned in the wind, the kind of sound I used to love, evidence of solid beams holding strong. Now it sounded like a warning. I sat at my desk, the statement and the contract spread before me. Each page was a weapon and a risk. If Hayes found them before morning, everything collapsed. So I placed the envelope back inside the toolbox, slid it under the floorboards, and sealed it tight. My first hammer lay on top, a relic of beginnings. It seemed right that my defense would rest on the same steel that had built my life. As midnight passed, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A car slowed outside again. I didn't move to the window. I didn't need to. I knew who it was. For a long moment the engine idled, headlights glowing against the curtains. Then slowly it drove away. Tomorrow the church bells would ring, and so would the reckoning. The church bells began to toll, steady and solemn, their echoes carrying across the town like a summons. I stood near the back, unseen by most, my jacket heavier than ever with the papers folded inside. Every pew was filled, the air thick with perfume and whispers. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, painting the aisle in reds and blues. This was supposed to be a day of joy, and yet all I felt was the sharp tension of a storm about to break. At the front the pastor waited, smile fixed, hands folded. Hayes stood nearby, immaculate as ever, silver tie catching the light, his posture radiating control. He glanced down the aisle, saw me, and let the corner of his mouth curl upward. A smile not of welcome but of triumph. Music swelled. The bridesmaids entered, their dresses flowing like waves. Then Emily appeared at the door, veil lifted, bouquet trembling in her hands. For a moment my breath caught. She was radiant, fragile, and every bit the little girl I remembered walking into her first classroom, clutching my hand too tightly. Hayes moved toward her, extending his arm. The congregation rose, a rustle of fabric and excitement. And then Emily hesitated. Her eyes swept the crowd, landed on me at the back. For the briefest moment her lips parted as though she might call out. But Hayes leaned close, whispering something no one else could hear, and she lowered her gaze. He took her hand. I couldn't let it happen. I stepped into the aisle, my shoes echoing against the stone floor. The room stilled. Every head turned. Whispers rose, sharp and cutting. Hayes stiffened, his smile faltering. "William," he said softly, voice meant only for me, "this is not your moment." But I kept walking, each step heavy with years of silence and sacrifice. When I reached them, I stopped, standing between Hayes and the pastor. "This is my daughter," I said, my voice steady. "And before she takes another step, everyone here deserves to know the truth." Gasps rippled through the pews. Hayes laughed lightly, feigning calm. "Ignore him," he told the crowd. "The man is confused. Grief and jealousy have made him bitter." I pulled the envelope from my jacket, holding it high. "Jealousy doesn't write contracts, this does." I handed the papers to the pastor, who adjusted his glasses and began to skim. Murmurs spread, the congregation leaning forward. "Annual renewal," the pastor read aloud, his voice firm. "Subject to mutual consent." Emily lifted her head. Her eyes widened, hope flickering like a candle in wind. Hayes's face hardened. "Legal jargon," he snapped. "Nothing more than technicality." "It's more than that," I countered. "It means you don't own her. It means tomorrow your grip ends unless she chooses otherwise. And she does not choose you." Silence fell, broken only by the sound of Emily's bouquet slipping from her hands, petals scattering across the floor. She turned to Hayes, her voice trembling but clear. "You told me there was no escape, that I had no choice." His jaw tightened. "I protected you. I saved you from ruin." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You caged me, and I let you because I was afraid, but I'm not afraid anymore." She reached for me, her hand warm, steady. "Dad, will you walk me?" The congregation erupted, some in applause, some in shocked whispers. Hayes's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but the pastor held up a hand. "Mr. Hayes, I think it's best you step aside." For once Hayes had no words. He turned sharply, pushing through the side door, his polished shoes clattering against stone. The silver tie caught the light one last time before disappearing. The music swelled again, hesitant at first, then stronger. Emily slipped her arm through mine. I felt her tremble, but beneath the fear was resolve. Step by step we walked the aisle together. The pews blurred as tears filled my eyes. Every stride was more than distance, it was reclamation, of love, of presence, of a father's place that could not be inked out of existence. At the altar the pastor's smile softened. The vows began, words of promise spoken clear, free from manipulation. Emily's voice was steady, her groom's eyes shining with devotion. And I stood close, not erased but restored, a witness to truth stronger than whispers. When the bells tolled again, it was different. Not ominous, not heavy. They rang bright, unburdened, spilling joy across the town. Outside, sunlight bathed the steps as guests poured out, laughter returning to the air. Emily hugged me tightly, her veil brushing my cheek. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, "for not letting go." I held her as long as I could, memorizing the moment. "Always," I said. Later, when the crowd dispersed and music faded, I walked alone down the empty aisle. The scattered petals still lay on the floor where Emily had dropped her bouquet. I bent, picked one up, and held it between my fingers, fragile, imperfect, but still beautiful, just like family, broken, mended, and worth fighting for. If this story touched something in you, I'd be grateful if you gave it a like. Subscribe if you'd like to walk with me through more journeys of family, loss, and hope. And share in the comments where you're watching from. I truly enjoy hearing your voices. Thank you for spending this time with me.